It was a warm, serene afternoon at Willow Creek Park, the kind of day where the world seemed to pause in quiet celebration of its own beauty. The sun bathed the landscape in golden light, making the leaves shimmer and the gentle ripples on the pond sparkle like tiny diamonds. Birds chirped cheerfully from their perches, flitting from branch to branch in a display of carefree energy. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, blending harmoniously with the rhythmic patter of joggers' footsteps on the gravel paths. Nestled within this idyllic scene was a man sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench near the edge of the pond. He appeared utterly unremarkable at first glance, a lone figure quietly enjoying the day, his baseball cap tilted just low enough to shadow his face. His hands rested casually on his lap, and he seemed absorbed in the stillness around him, as if he were part of the scenery rather than a visitor to it. There was a peculiar sense of calm about him, though. Not the kind of calm that comes from relaxation or a leisurely stroll in the park, but a deeper stillness, one forged in moments of challenge and tempered by time. He wasn't restless, nor did he seem particularly interested in the lively energy surrounding him. He sat with an air of quiet authority, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed yet firmly set. Even the way he breathed was measured, as though he had long ago mastered the art of conserving energy for the precise moment it was needed. To the casual observer, he was just another retiree, someone who might spend his days feeding the ducks or reminiscing about better times. But those who looked closer, who really paid attention, might have noticed the faint scars that crisscrossed his hands. They might have caught the way his eyes, though mostly hidden beneath the brim of his cap, scanned the park with subtle precision, taking in every detail without seeming to move. There was something about him that didn't quite match the peaceful setting, a quiet tension that seemed both out of place and perfectly at home. This man, whoever he was, had a story, though it wasn't the kind he would share with strangers over coffee or in idle park conversations. His story was written in those scars, in the way he held himself, and in the faint but unmistakable aura of control he exuded. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice or make grand gestures to command attention. His presence was enough. The park continued its gentle hum around him, unaware of the undercurrent of mystery that sat so still on that bench. A mother pushed her baby in a stroller, pausing to admire the fountain at the center of the pond. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they tossed a frisbee back and forth, their carefree energy filling the air. An elderly couple walked hand in hand, their conversation soft and comforting, like a melody only they could hear. Yet amid all this, the man remained an enigma. People glanced at him as they passed, but never for long. Something about him discouraged lingering attention, as though their instincts whispered that he was best left undisturbed. Perhaps it was his silence, or perhaps it was the way his presence seemed to ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, a young boy on a scooter veered toward the man's bench, his path curving in a playful zigzag. The boy's mother called out to him, her voice laced with gentle urgency. The boy glanced back and, catching sight of his mother's expression, quickly changed direction. Even he, in his innocence, seemed to sense that the man was not to be bothered. The man, for his part, gave no indication that he noticed the boy or anyone else around him. His stillness was absolute, his attention seemingly fixed on the ducks gliding effortlessly across the pond. But there was more to his gaze than met the eye. He wasn't just watching the ducks, he was observing everything: the subtle shifts in the wind, the way the shadows lengthened as the afternoon progressed, the patterns of movement and sound that made up the park's rhythm. To most, it was just another peaceful day at Willow Creek Park. But for this man, peace was not something he took for granted. He understood its fragility, how quickly it could be shattered. Perhaps that was why he seemed so at ease yet so alert, a paradox wrapped in a simple baseball cap and a weathered bench. He knew, better than most, how easily tranquility could give way to chaos. And chaos, though it didn't know it yet, was on its way. The faint sound of distant engines began to rise, a low hum at first, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of chirping birds and laughter. But it grew steadily louder, a growl that carried with it a sense of disruption. People turned their heads toward the sound, their conversations faltering as curiosity and a touch of unease settled over the park. The man on the bench didn't move. His posture remained unchanged, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Yet there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes beneath the brim of his cap. Whatever was coming, he was ready. The low growl of engines began to thrum through the peaceful afternoon, the kind of sound that seemed to crawl up from the ground and press into the air. It grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that didn't belong in this tranquil setting. At first, it was just a faint anomaly, something distant and easily ignored. But soon, the noise became impossible to overlook, slicing through the serenity of Willow Creek Park like a jagged knife. People started to take notice. The joggers on the path slowed their pace, heads turning toward the source of the disturbance. Parents instinctively gathered their children closer, their laughter fading into uneasy murmurs. The elderly couple paused mid-stroll, the woman placing a hand on her husband's arm, a silent question passing between them. And still, the man on the bench didn't move. He sat as he had before, a figure of stillness amid the growing tension. His face remained shaded by the brim of his cap, his expression hidden, but there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere around him. It was as though he had anticipated this moment long before the engines had even started. A flash of chrome and leather appeared at the park's entrance, the sunlight glinting off polished metal as the first motorcycle roared into view. Then another. And another. One by one, a pack of bikers rolled into Willow Creek Park, their machines growling like wild animals marking their territory. There were 8 of them in total, each one clad in black leather and denim, their jackets adorned with patches that hinted at a shared allegiance. The leader, riding at the front of the pack, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and piercing eyes. His name was Razor, a name that seemed to suit him, given the sharpness of his gaze and the air of authority he carried. Razor slowed his bike to a halt near the pond, the other bikers following suit in a synchronized display of power. They dismounted in unison, their movements confident and deliberate. The park, once filled with the gentle sounds of nature, was now dominated by the metallic clinks of boots hitting the ground and the low, lingering rumble of idling engines. The gang seemed to radiate an energy that demanded attention, their presence impossible to ignore. Razor took off his helmet, shaking out his hair and scanning the park with a predatory grin. His gaze swept over the joggers, the families, and the elderly couple, lingering just long enough to make them uncomfortable before moving on. Finally, his eyes landed on the man sitting on the bench. At first, Razor seemed to dismiss him. Just another old guy in the park, probably here to enjoy the sunshine and feed the ducks. But then, something about the man's stillness caught Razor's attention. Unlike everyone else, who was either staring openly at the gang or pretending not to notice them, this man didn't react at all. He didn't even glance in their direction. Razor didn't like that. "Hey, Gramps." Razor's voice boomed across the park, shattering the fragile silence. He started walking toward the bench, his boots crunching against the gravel with each step. The rest of the gang followed, forming a loose semicircle behind him. The man didn't respond. He remained seated, his gaze fixed on the pond as though he hadn't heard Razor at all. "I'm talking to you," Razor barked, stopping a few feet away from the bench. His grin had faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "You deaf, or just plain stupid?" At this, the man finally moved. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Razor's presence without fully turning toward him. His movements were slow and deliberate, like someone who had all the time in the world. "Neither," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "I just didn't realize you were speaking to me." The gang chuckled at this, their laughter rough and mocking. Razor's irritation deepened. Well, now you know, Razor said, stepping closer. And since you're new around here, let me make something clear. This park? It's our spot. You're sittin' on our bench. The man turned his head slightly more, just enough for the shadow of his cap to lift and reveal a hint of his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that Razor wasn't expecting. Your spot, the man repeated, his tone even and devoid of emotion. I wasn't aware public parks had assigned seating. The gang's laughter grew louder, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of laughter that promised trouble, that thrived on intimidation and control. Razor's grin returned, though it was sharper now, more dangerous. You've got a smart mouth, old man, Razor said, his voice low and menacing. But let me give you some advice. Around here, you show a little respect. Otherwise, he gestured to the gang behind him, the threat implicit but unmistakable. The man didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed more relaxed now, leaning back slightly on the bench and crossing one leg over the other. Respect is earned, he said simply, his tone unbothered. For a moment, there was silence. Razor stared at the man, his jaw tightening as he processed the response. The gang shifted uneasily behind him, sensing the tension but unsure how their leader would respond. Finally, Razor broke the silence with a bark of laughter, though there was no humor in it. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, shaking his head. But guts won't get you far when you're outnumbered. The man didn't reply. He simply tilted his head back slightly, the shadow of his cap once again hiding his eyes. Razor took another step closer, his boots now inches from the bench. He leaned forward, his face hovering just above the man's. You think you're tough, huh? Razor sneered. You think you can sit there and disrespect me in front of my crew? The man remained silent. His stillness was almost unsettling, a stark contrast to Razor's aggressive energy. It was as though he was waiting for something, biding his time. And then, in a voice so calm it almost didn't register as a threat, he said, You don't want to do this. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Razor blinked, caught off guard by the man's tone. It wasn't a plea or a warning, it was a statement of fact, delivered with quiet certainty. The gang, sensing Razor's hesitation, began to murmur among themselves. Razor straightened up, his pride refusing to let him back down. Oh, I'm doing this, he said, cracking his knuckles. And you're gonna wish you stayed home today, old man. Still, the man didn't move. He simply adjusted his cap, pulling it lower over his eyes. And in that moment, anyone paying attention might have noticed the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a warm, serene afternoon at Willow Creek Park, the kind of day that seemed tailor-made for relaxation and gentle reflection. The sun shone brightly but not harshly, its golden rays filtered through the canopy of trees, casting playful patterns on the ground. The park was alive with the sounds of nature and people enjoying its beauty. Birds chirped melodious tunes, their songs weaving seamlessly into the distant laughter of children playing tag near the swings. Joggers moved along the winding paths, their rhythmic footsteps blending with the crunch of gravel beneath their sneakers. Here and there, couples strolled hand in hand, exchanging soft words and quiet smiles. Amid this picturesque setting, an unassuming man sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. He was an older gentleman, though not so old that he seemed frail. His face was partly obscured by the low brim of a baseball cap, its color a muted green that blended with the natural surroundings. His clothing was plain, a faded button-down shirt and khaki trousers that suggested comfort over style. Yet, there was something about him that didn't quite match the tranquility around him. His posture was relaxed but not slouched. He sat with his back straight and shoulders squared, a quiet confidence radiating from his stillness. His hands rested loosely on his lap, the fingers scarred and calloused, speaking of a life that had seen hard work or perhaps harder battles. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone like so many others might have. He simply existed in the moment, as though the stillness of the park was an extension of his own being. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like just another retiree, someone who had come to the park to feed the ducks or enjoy the sunshine. But there was a subtle intensity about him that set him apart. His gaze, though mostly hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, seemed sharp and purposeful. He wasn't just looking at the pond in front of him, he was observing everything. The ducks gliding across the water, the way the wind rustled the leaves, the faint hum of distant conversations, nothing escaped his notice. If anyone had dared to look closer, they might have seen the faint lines etched around his eyes, not just the marks of age but of experience. They might have wondered about the stories behind those scars on his hands, about the life that had shaped the man who now sat so quietly on that bench. But no one asked. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was something deeper, an unspoken understanding that this was a man who carried secrets, the kind that were better left undisturbed. The park continued its gentle hum around him, oblivious to the quiet mystery of the man on the bench. A young boy raced past on a scooter, his laughter echoing as his mother called out for him to slow down. A trio of teens lounged near the fountain, their voices rising and falling in animated conversation. A street performer strummed a cheerful tune on his guitar, his hat lying open on the ground for tips. Life went on as it always did, the world blissfully unaware of the subtle shift that was about to occur. The man, for his part, remained motionless, his calm demeanor unwavering. He appeared to be lost in thought, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. He noticed the way the clouds lazily drifted across the sky, their shapes shifting with the wind. He noticed the woman sitting on a nearby bench, absent-mindedly flipping through a book but not really reading. He noticed the dog tugging at its leash, eager to chase after a squirrel darting up a tree. And then he noticed something else. It was faint at first, barely audible against the backdrop of laughter and birdsong. A low, distant rumble, growing steadily louder with each passing second. The sound was out of place, discordant with the park's peaceful melody. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, though his posture didn't change. His ears, finely attuned, picked up on the rhythm of the noise, deep, guttural, mechanical. Engines. Not just one, but several. The sound grew closer, breaking through the serenity like a storm on a clear day. People began to notice, their conversations faltering as curiosity and unease rippled through the crowd. A father paused mid-throw, the frisbee in his hand forgotten as he turned toward the source of the noise. A group of joggers stopped in their tracks, their heads swiveling in unison. Even the ducks in the pond seemed to sense the disturbance, their gentle quacks fading into silence. The man on the bench remained still, his expression unreadable. But his hands, resting on his lap, shifted ever so slightly. His fingers flexed once, as though testing their readiness, before settling again. The noise reached a crescendo as a line of motorcycles roared into view, their chrome frames gleaming in the sunlight. There were at least 8 of them, their riders clad in leather and denim, their faces obscured by helmets or bandanas. The gang moved as one, their bikes weaving through the park's entrance and spreading out like a pack of wolves claiming their territory. The leader, riding at the front, was a towering man with broad shoulders and a thick beard that jutted out from beneath his helmet. He slowed his bike to a stop near the fountain, the others following suit in a synchronized display of power. One by one, they dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with deliberate force. Conversations died completely. Parents pulled their children closer, their instincts urging them to retreat. The elderly couple who had been walking hand in hand froze in place, the woman clutching her partner's arm. The park, once filled with life and laughter, now held its breath. The gang fanned out, their movements casual but purposeful. They weren't in a hurry, their confidence evident in the way they strolled through the park as if they owned it. The leader removed his helmet, shaking out his hair and scanning the crowd with a predatory grin. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the park's occupants like a spotlight, searching for something or someone. And then his gaze landed on the man on the bench. At first, the leader seemed to dismiss him. Just another old guy, sitting quietly in the park, no different from the others who had scattered like leaves in the wind. But then he paused, his grin faltering slightly. There was something about the man's stillness, about the way he seemed completely unfazed by the commotion, that caught the leader's attention. The man didn't move. He didn't look up, didn't react. He sat as he had before, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. The leader's grin returned, though this time it was sharper, more dangerous. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the park. "You lost, or are you just too stubborn to move?" The man didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, not bothering to look up. The gang laughed, their laughter rough and mocking. The leader took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But you're sittin' on the wrong bench, Gramps." The man finally tilted his head, just enough for the leader to catch a glimpse of his face beneath the cap. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic. Just calm, steady resolve. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone even. The leader chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "Yeah," he said, cracking his knuckles. "And if you're smart, you'll get up and walk away before I make you." The park seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like static in the air. The man didn't move. Instead, he leaned back slightly on the bench, his hands resting at his sides. "I think I'll stay," he said quietly. The leader's grin twisted into a sneer. He gestured to his crew, who began to close in, their boots striking the ground in unison. And still, the man remained calm, his stillness unbroken. The storm had arrived, but the man on the bench? He was ready. The bikers moved like a pack of wolves, surrounding the bench with deliberate steps. Each one carried an air of confidence, their sneers and smirks etched deep into their faces. Razor, the leader, crossed his arms as he looked down at the man who hadn't flinched. It was as though the biker's presence meant nothing to him, as though he couldn't be bothered by their imposing figures or the sheer volume of their presence. One of the bikers, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, took a step closer. "You got a death wish, Pops," he growled, his voice sharp and taunting. The man finally looked up, but only slightly, just enough for the shadow of his cap to lift. His eyes were calm and calculating, betraying none of the fear the gang had likely expected. Instead, he tilted his head ever so slightly, as though inspecting the group with quiet curiosity. "No," he said simply, his tone devoid of hostility. "But it seems like you might." The response wasn't loud or confrontational, but it carried a weight that silenced the gang for a moment. It was the kind of statement that wasn't meant to provoke, it was simply the truth, spoken by someone who knew more than he was letting on. Razor laughed, a sharp bark of sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got a mouth on you, old man," he said, leaning down slightly, his face inches from the man's. "Let's see if you're still talkin' when I knock you off that bench." The other bikers snickered, their laughter rough and menacing. One of them, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound echoing in the tense stillness of the park. Around them, the bystanders watched in frozen silence. Parents ushered their children behind trees, while couples and joggers lingered at a safe distance, torn between fear and morbid curiosity. No one dared intervene. No one wanted to draw the attention of the gang. Except the man on the bench. He leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other in a motion so casual it was almost dismissive. His hands rested loosely on the armrest of the bench, his fingers calm and steady. "I'd think twice if I were you," he said, his voice low and measured. Razor's sneer widened into a grin, the challenge lighting a fire in his eyes. He straightened up, rolling his shoulders as though preparing for a fight. "Oh, I don't think so," he said. "You're all out of chances, old man." As Razor raised a hand, perhaps to grab the man or shove him off the bench, something unexpected happened. The man moved, not quickly, but deliberately, lifting his head fully for the first time. The cap's shadow fell away, revealing a face lined with age and experience. His eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Razor's with an intensity that froze him mid-motion. "You've already made your first mistake," the man said softly, his tone calm but unyielding. For a moment, Razor hesitated. The man's gaze was like a weight pressing down on him, heavy with something he couldn't quite place, something dangerous. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his crew, and certainly not in front of a crowd. "Yeah," Razor growled, shoving his hesitation aside. "What mistake was that?" The man's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You underestimated me." And then he moved. What happened next was so fast that most of the onlookers barely registered it. One moment, Razor was standing over the man, his hand outstretched. The next, he was stumbling backward, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. He let out a yell of pain as he dropped to one knee, clutching his wrist. The man was on his feet now, moving with a fluidity and precision that seemed impossible for someone his age. He didn't attack further. Instead, he stood there calmly, his posture loose but ready, his hands open and relaxed. The gang froze, their bravado faltering as they took in the scene. Razor, their leader, was on the ground, his face twisted in pain and confusion. And the man who had just disarmed him. He looked as though he hadn't even broken a sweat. "Who the hell are you?" Razor snarled, his voice thick with anger and humiliation. The man tilted his head slightly, considering the question. For a moment, he didn't answer, his eyes scanning the group as though weighing his options. "Just someone who came to enjoy the park," he said finally, his tone light but firm. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence cracking under the weight of uncertainty. One of them, the burly man with the tree trunk arms, stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You think you can take all of us?" he rumbled, his voice low and threatening. The man's faint smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think," he said simply. "I know." The statement hung in the air, heavy with conviction. The burly man lunged forward, his fists swinging in a wide arc. But the man on the bench moved again, faster than anyone could have anticipated. He sidestepped the attack with ease, his movements precise and controlled. Before the burly man could recover, the older man delivered a sharp, calculated strike to his shoulder, followed by a sweep of his leg that sent him crashing to the ground. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock and awe spreading through the park. The gang, now visibly shaken, hesitated. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't some frail old man they could intimidate for fun. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. The man straightened, adjusting his cap as though nothing had happened. His gaze swept over the remaining bikers, his expression calm but unrelenting. "This is your second mistake," he said, his voice carrying across the park. "You came looking for trouble, and now you've found it?" For a moment, no one moved. The gang seemed frozen in place, their bravado replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Razor struggled to his feet, his face red with anger and humiliation. "Get him," he barked, his voice hoarse. "Take him down." The gang hesitated for a split second, then charged as one. But the man was ready. The tension in the park was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Razor scoffed at the man's calm demeanor, mistaking it for arrogance. Around them, the other bikers smirked and jeered, their confidence bolstered by the numbers they had on their side. The gang of 8 encircled the bench completely now, their movements deliberate and predatory, like sharks closing in on their prey. "You don't seem to get it, old man," Razor sneered, his hand twitching near his jacket where the faint glint of metal peeked through. "This isn't your park anymore. It's ours. And you don't tell us what mistakes we're making." The wiry biker with the snake tattoo took a step closer, leaning in with a mocking grin. "Maybe he thinks he's in one of those action movies. You know, the kind where the old guy beats up a whole gang." His laughter was sharp and grating. "Hate to break it to you, Gramps, but this is real life." The man stood still, his calm gaze shifting between the bikers. He seemed almost detached from the chaos, as though he were watching them from a distance rather than standing in the center of their encirclement. But in reality, his mind was anything but distant. He was analyzing everything: the placement of each biker, the weight of their steps, their breathing patterns. Every detail painted a clearer picture of what was to come. "You're wasting your time," the man said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the bikers' laughter like a blade. "Walk away. Now." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, the bikers hesitated. There was something in the man's tone, something steady, unshakable, that made their bravado falter. But Razor wasn't one to back down, especially in front of his crew. "You hear that?" Razor barked, his grin splitting into a sneer. "The old man thinks he's giving us orders." He turned to his gang, gesturing with exaggerated amusement. "What do you say, boys? Should we teach him some respect?" The bikers roared their agreement, their laughter filling the air like a storm cloud. Razor nodded, satisfied, and took a step forward. "All right, Gramps. Let's see how tough you really are." But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, tilting it slightly so his face caught the sunlight. For the first time, the gang got a clear look at his eyes, sharp, focused, and piercing. It was a look that spoke of experience, of battles fought and won, of lessons learned the hard way. It was the look of someone who had faced far worse than a group of bikers on a sunny afternoon. "You're not the first," the man said quietly, almost to himself. "And you won't be the last." Before Razor could respond, the man moved. It was sudden and unexpected, a blur of motion that caught everyone off guard. One moment, he was standing calmly. The next, his hand shot out like a striking cobra, snatching the blade from Razor's jacket before the gang leader could react. The park seemed to hold its breath as the man flipped the knife expertly in his hand, examining it briefly before tossing it into a nearby bush. The sound of the blade disappearing into the foliage was almost anticlimactic, a small click that belied the gravity of the moment. Razor froze, his hand still hovering near the empty space in his jacket. His expression shifted from smug confidence to stunned disbelief. The rest of the gang exchanged uneasy glances, their cocky grins fading as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The man stepped back, his movements measured and deliberate. He placed his hands loosely at his sides, his posture relaxed yet ready. "I'll say it one more time," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Walk away." Razor's pride wouldn't allow him to back down, not after being disarmed so effortlessly. "You're gonna pay for that," he snarled, his voice dripping with anger. "Nobody makes a fool out of me." He lunged forward, his fists swinging wildly. But the man sidestepped the attack with ease, his movements precise and economical. Razor stumbled past him, his momentum carrying him off balance, and the man delivered a quick, controlled strike to his ribs, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the gang erupted into chaos. 2 bikers charged at once, their heavy boots thundering against the gravel. The man didn't wait for them to reach him. He stepped forward, meeting them head-on with a series of calculated movements. He ducked under a punch, grabbed one biker's arm, and twisted it into a lock that dropped the man to his knees. The second biker hesitated for a split second, just long enough for the man to deliver a swift kick to his shin, sending him crumpling to the ground. The crowd that had gathered at a distance watched in stunned silence, their disbelief etched onto their faces. This wasn't just an ordinary man defending himself. Every move he made was deliberate, efficient, and practiced, like a choreographed dance of precision and power. It was clear now that this wasn't some retired office worker or an aging grandfather out for a stroll. This man was something else entirely. As more bikers joined the fray, the man's movements only grew sharper, more focused. He used their own momentum against them, redirecting their attacks with minimal effort. A punch became an opening for a counter-strike. A lunge turned into an opportunity to sweep a leg. Within minutes, 4 of the bikers were on the ground, groaning in pain and clutching their injuries. The remaining members of the gang hesitated, their confidence shattered. Razor struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and rage. "What the hell are you?" he spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around at the fallen bikers, his gaze settling back on Razor. "I told you," he said simply, his tone steady and even. "You made a mistake." Razor clenched his fists, his body trembling with fury. "You're dead, old man. You hear me? Dead." The man's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor giving way to something harder, colder. For the first time, there was a hint of steel in his voice as he said, "I've heard worse." The bikers regrouped, their faces twisted in varying shades of anger and fear. The man hadn't just disarmed them, he'd dismantled their confidence, piece by piece, and the cracks were beginning to show. Razor, clutching his side where the man's calculated strike had landed, barked orders at the others, his voice raw with desperation. "Don't just stand there. Take him down," he yelled, his bravado faltering as he glanced nervously at the man. The wiry biker with the snake tattoo stepped forward again, a length of chain dangling from his hand. He swung it in lazy circles, the metal links glinting ominously in the sunlight. "You've had your fun, old man," he sneered. "Now it's our turn." The man remained still, his eyes fixed on the chain, calculating its reach, the force behind each swing. He made no move to attack or retreat. Instead, he spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "Think about what you're doing," he said, his tone almost conversational. "That chain won't protect you from what's coming next." Snake Tattoo laughed, a sharp, grating sound that carried none of the confidence it was meant to convey. "Big words for someone who's outnumbered." The man's gaze flicked briefly to the fallen bikers groaning on the ground, then back to Snake Tattoo. "Am I?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Snake Tattoo hesitated, his confidence wavering for a split second, but his pride pushed him forward. With a loud growl, he swung the chain in a wide arc, aiming for the man's head. The man moved like water, flowing with effortless precision. He sidestepped the swing, his movements so fluid it was as though he'd predicted the attack before it even began. As the chain whistled harmlessly past him, he grabbed it mid-swing, yanking it with a sharp twist. Snake Tattoo stumbled forward, his grip on the chain faltering as the man used his own momentum against him. Before Snake Tattoo could recover, the man delivered a swift strike to his forearm, forcing him to release the chain entirely. With a flick of his wrist, the man coiled the chain and tossed it aside, where it clattered onto the gravel like a discarded toy. Snake Tattoo fell to his knees, clutching his arm and cursing under his breath. Another biker, a stocky man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, stepped in, wielding a broken bottle. He didn't hesitate, lunging forward with reckless abandon. The man met his charge with a disarming simplicity that bordered on elegance. He sidestepped the lunge, catching the biker's wrist mid-thrust and twisting it sharply. The bottle slipped from the biker's grasp and shattered on the ground. A quick, controlled shove sent him stumbling backward, landing unceremoniously on his rear. The crowd that had gathered at a safe distance began to murmur, their initial fear giving way to awe. Parents who had shielded their children moments ago now watched openly, their curiosity piqued by the man's extraordinary skill. Couples whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the bikers and the lone figure who stood against them. "Who is he?" someone in the crowd murmured. "He doesn't look like much, but," another trailed off, their words hanging in the air. The remaining bikers, now visibly shaken, looked to Razor for direction. Razor, however, was too preoccupied with his own swirling mix of humiliation and disbelief to provide any coherent orders. His gang, which had thrived on fear and intimidation, was crumbling in the face of an opponent they couldn't understand. The man adjusted his cap again, his expression as calm as ever. He took a single step forward, and the bikers instinctively stepped back, as though his mere presence had become a threat. "I've seen men like you before," the man said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think strength comes from numbers, from weapons, from fear. But real strength isn't something you can fake." Razor bristled at the words, his face flushing red. "You think you're better than us? You think you're untouchable," he spat, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I don't think," he replied evenly. "I know." Razor's hands trembled with rage as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a second blade, a smaller, sharper one that gleamed dangerously in the sunlight. "Enough of this," he roared, charging at the man with a wild, desperate fury. Time seemed to slow as Razor closed the distance between them. The man didn't move immediately, waiting until the last possible moment before shifting his weight. With a swift, fluid motion, he sidestepped Razor's charge and caught his wrist, twisting it with just enough force to send the blade clattering to the ground. Razor let out a cry of pain, stumbling forward and falling to his knees. The man stepped back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He didn't deliver a finishing blow. He didn't need to. Razor's defeat was already complete, his pride shattered alongside his plans for dominance. The park fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the labored breathing of the bikers who were still conscious. The crowd watched in stunned awe, their disbelief slowly giving way to a realization that this was no ordinary man. Razor looked up at the man from where he knelt, his face twisted with equal parts rage and fear. What are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around at the fallen bikers, at the chain and broken bottle lying discarded on the ground, at the stunned faces of the onlookers. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "I'm just someone who's seen too much," he said finally, his tone soft but resolute. "Someone who's learned how to end trouble before it starts." With that, he turned and began walking away, his steps calm and unhurried. The bikers made no move to stop him. Razor, still kneeling on the ground, could only watch as the man disappeared into the distance, his figure blending into the trees at the edge of the park. The crowd began to disperse, their hushed conversations buzzing with speculation and awe. Parents gathered their children, joggers resumed their routes, and the park slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But the memory of what had just happened lingered, etched into the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. As for the man, he continued walking, his face calm but his mind already elsewhere. He knew this wasn't the end. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to run from his past. The gang froze as if time itself had stopped. Razor's breath hitched, his gaze locked on the tattoo. One of the younger bikers, wide-eyed and trembling, whispered under his breath, "No way, not that Marcus Kane." "Shut it." Razor barked, but his voice cracked, betraying the fear bubbling just beneath the surface. He turned back to the man General Kane, who now stood taller, his calm demeanor replaced by an air of unyielding authority. Kane's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You've made two mistakes today, Razor. The first was thinking this park and these people were yours to terrorize." His eyes scanned the gang, taking in their battered, shaken forms. "The second was thinking I'd let it slide." The crowd, still gathered at a cautious distance, held their breath. Kane took a single step forward, and Razor instinctively stepped back, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Why, you think you're untouchable, old man?" Razor stammered, though his bravado was all but gone. "You're just some has-been soldier. We're not scared of you." Kane raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "That so? Let's find out." He moved again, faster than anyone thought possible for a man of his age. Razor barely had time to react before Kane's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him forward. Razor's knife, which he had tried to brandish again, clattered uselessly to the ground. "Let me teach you something about fear," Kane said, his voice low but thunderous. He leaned in closer, his piercing eyes locking onto Razor's. "Fear isn't about how loud you are, or how many men you've got at your back. Fear comes from knowing you're outmatched, that no amount of bluster will save you." With a swift shove, Kane sent Razor sprawling to the ground. The other bikers flinched but didn't dare move to help their leader. "You've been living in a bubble, Razor," Kane continued, his tone almost conversational now. "Surrounding yourself with weaker men, convincing yourself you're strong. But strength isn't about dominance. It's about control." He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate weight. "And right now, you have none." Razor scrambled to his feet, his face a mix of rage and terror. "This ain't over," he shouted, his voice breaking. He turned to his gang, his desperation evident. "Get him." The bikers hesitated. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence shattered. Kane didn't wait for them to decide. He struck first, his movements a masterclass in precision and efficiency. The wiry biker with the snake tattoo lunged at him with a chain, but Kane caught it mid-swing, wrapping it around his forearm and pulling hard. The biker stumbled forward, and with one swift motion, Kane flipped him onto the ground. The chain landed in a heap beside the fallen man. Another biker, a burly one with fists like hammers, charged at Kane with a roar. Kane sidestepped the assault, delivering a sharp elbow to the biker's ribs, followed by a quick sweep of the legs. The larger man hit the ground with a thud, groaning in pain. Each confrontation played out in seconds, leaving the gang visibly diminished. Kane's movements were fluid, like a dance honed over years of discipline. He didn't waste energy, and every strike served a purpose. By the time the last biker fell, clutching his dislocated shoulder, Razor was alone, trembling as he looked around at his fallen crew. The crowd erupted into murmurs, awe and disbelief rippling through them. You can't do this." Razor spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're retired. You're nobody." Kane tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said. "I'm retired. I came here for peace. But men like you make that impossible." He stepped closer, his shadow looming over Razor. "So I remind you what real strength looks like." Razor dropped to his knees, his bravado entirely gone. "Please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "We didn't know who you were. We didn't mean." "Spare me the excuses," Kane cut him off, his voice sharp. "You came here looking for easy targets. You found me instead." He crouched down, leveling Razor with a steely gaze. "You'll leave this park. You'll leave these people. And if I ever see you or any of your men here again," he paused, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "you won't get a second chance." Razor nodded frantically, tears pooling in his eyes. Why you won't? I swear. Kane stood, adjusting his sleeves as he stepped back. Good. Now go. Razor scrambled to his feet, grabbing the nearest biker and dragging him away. The rest of the gang followed, limping and clutching their injuries as they retreated. The once mighty gang looked pitiful, a shadow of the terror they had tried to project. As they disappeared from view, the park erupted in applause. Parents, joggers, and onlookers cheered, their earlier fear replaced by relief and admiration. Children pointed excitedly, their voices rising in awe. "Did you see him?" one boy exclaimed. "He was like a superhero." Kane shook his head slightly, retrieving his fallen cap and placing it back on his head. He glanced at the crowd, offering a small nod before turning toward the path that led out of the park. "Wait," a woman called, hurrying toward him. "Who are you?" Kane paused, looking over his shoulder. For a moment, it seemed like he might explain, but instead, he simply said, "Just someone who doesn't like bullies." With that, he walked away, his figure disappearing into the horizon as the crowd watched in silent respect. Though he sought no recognition, his actions left an indelible mark, a story that would be told and retold by those who had witnessed it. And somewhere in the distance, the retired general allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. Peace was hard to come by, but sometimes, you had to fight for it. And he'd do it again, without hesitation. The tension lingered in the air long after the bikers had vanished from sight. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of amazement and disbelief rippling through them. Parents gathered their children close, joggers resumed their interrupted paths, and the usual rhythm of Willow Creek Park cautiously returned. Yet, for many, the memory of what they had just witnessed lingered heavily in their minds. Kane continued his walk toward the edge of the park, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed, as though nothing unusual had occurred. His calmness contrasted starkly with the storm of emotions around him. To those who had seen his swift, calculated movements, his composed demeanor now seemed almost superhuman. But Kane knew better. His years in the service had taught him to carry the weight of every decision, every action. He had learned to walk away from moments like this with a clear head and an even clearer conscience. Still, a faint heaviness tugged at him. Violence, even justified, was never something he relished. "Excuse me, sir." The voice brought Kane to a halt. He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto the source. It was the same woman who had called out to him earlier, a petite figure with kind eyes, now holding the hand of a wide-eyed little boy. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm despite a slight tremor. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Kane nodded, tipping his cap slightly. "I just did what anyone should," he replied, his tone modest. The boy stepped forward, tugging on his mother's hand. "Are you a hero?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent curiosity. Kane crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "No," he said softly. "Heroes are the people who protect others every day, like your mom. I'm just someone who knows how to handle trouble." The boy frowned, as though processing the words, then nodded solemnly. "You're really strong, though." "Like, really strong?" Kane chuckled, the faintest smile playing on his lips. "It's not about being strong, kid. It's about knowing when to use it." As the mother and son thanked him one last time and walked away, Kane straightened, his expression growing pensive. He glanced at the sky, its serene blue a sharp contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments ago. Kane's thoughts drifted to a time long past, to a mission in a foreign land where he had once stood as the shield for those who couldn't protect themselves. He remembered a young soldier trembling before their first combat, asking Kane how he always stayed so calm. "It's not about staying calm," Kane had told him. "It's about focusing on what needs to be done. Fear is natural. What matters is not letting it control you." That lesson had stayed with him, guiding him through countless battles. And though this fight in the park had been far from a battlefield, the principles remained the same. Protect the innocent. Stand firm against bullies. Meanwhile, Razor and his battered crew had regrouped several blocks away in a deserted alley. The gang sat slumped against walls or leaned on their bikes, their bravado replaced with hushed conversations and pained groans. Razor paced back and forth, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "That old man," Razor hissed, punching the side of a dumpster. "He made fools of us." "Forget it, Razor," said Snake, the wiry biker with the snake tattoo. He winced as he held his ribs. "Did you see the way he moved? That guy's no ordinary retiree. He's something else. He's a nobody." Razor snapped, though his words rang hollow. One of the younger bikers, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. He said his name was Marcus Kane. The mention of the name silenced the group. A few exchanged uneasy glances, and one older biker muttered, "Kane? You mean the Marcus Kane? The one from the stories?" Razor whirled on him. "What stories?" "They say he's a legend," the older biker continued, his voice low. "A man who led elite missions, took down warlords, and vanished without a trace after retirement. If that's him, we're lucky he didn't do worse." Razor clenched his fists, his mind racing. He hated the idea of retreating, of looking weak, but the fear in his gut told him there was no winning against someone like Kane. Back at the park, Kane's walk continued uninterrupted, though he was aware of the lingering eyes watching him. He could feel the weight of their gratitude, their curiosity, but he preferred to leave without further interaction. As he reached the edge of the park, an older man sitting on a bench nodded in his direction. He had been watching the entire encounter, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You handled that well," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. Kane paused, studying him briefly. There was something familiar in the man's demeanor, a hint of shared experience. "Had to be done," Kane replied simply. The older man chuckled, tapping his cane against the ground. "A man like you doesn't just stumble into a park like this. What brings you here?" Kane hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Looking for peace." The older man nodded knowingly. "It's hard to find, isn't it? Especially for people like us." Kane didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of agreement passed through his eyes. With a final nod, he tipped his cap and continued on his way. As the day wore on, the story of the mysterious man who had stood up to the gang spread throughout the park and beyond. People whispered his name, though few believed it could truly be that Marcus Kane. "Do you think it was really him?" one jogger asked another. "I don't know," the other replied, shaking his head. "But whoever he was, he saved the day." Children imitated his moves, reenacting the scene with exaggerated punches and kicks. Parents shared the story over coffee, their voices a mix of awe and gratitude. And Kane? By the time the sun began to set, he was long gone, leaving nothing behind but the memory of his actions and the quiet resolve that had defined him for so many years. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, until the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the park. By the time the officers arrived, everything had already settled. The bikers were subdued, their bikes upended and scattered across the gravel paths. Razor and his gang were sprawled on the ground, nursing bruises, cuts, and battered pride, their earlier bravado now reduced to fear and frustration. Razor, still clutching his side where Marcus had struck, glared up at the retired general. His face twisted in pain and anger, but mostly, fear. "This isn't over," he spat, trying to push himself up, but his body was unwilling. Marcus stood over him, his expression cool and unwavering. He'd faced more dangerous situations than this, and dealing with an overconfident gang in a park was nothing in comparison. He crouched beside Razor, his gaze piercing. "It is for you," Marcus replied, his voice low and steady. Next time you decide to terrorize someone, remember this moment. And pray they're not me. Razor's eyes widened for a brief second before he sneered, though the defiance was shaky at best. You don't know who we are, who I am. Marcus' eyes narrowed. I don't care who you are. What matters is who you've hurt, and who you've chosen to become. He straightened up, brushing the dust from his hands, and turned away. You're lucky I didn't finish what I started. The bikers exchanged glances, and for the first time, uncertainty flashed across their faces. Razor may have been the leader, but even he realized that under different circumstances, Marcus could have ended them all with just a few more moves. They were nothing compared to the skill and precision of someone like him. As the police officers approached, their radios crackling with static, the atmosphere shifted. The onlookers who had gathered during the scuffle were now drifting back, their faces filled with awe and whispers of disbelief. They had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a man who could have walked away, who could have ignored the chaos, but instead chose to confront it with calm efficiency. They had seen a man who wasn't afraid to fight for justice. "Sir, you all right?" one of the officers asked, his eyes flicking over Marcus as he surveyed the scene. Marcus nodded. "I'm fine. They were just leaving." He glanced down at Razor, who was now being cuffed and dragged to his feet. The gang was too bruised and humiliated to offer any resistance. "Thank you for your help, sir," another officer said, looking over the group. "We've got it from here. You can go if you want." Marcus paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the officers, then turned back to the gang. "They'll be fine," he said with a small sigh. "Just don't let them get back to their old ways." He didn't need to say more. He knew that a few hours in the back of a squad car would hardly change the gang's behavior. But at least the park, for now, would be safe. The officers looked at each other, clearly not used to seeing such an easy resolution to an otherwise chaotic scene. "You sure you don't want to press charges?" one of them asked. "We can help with that." Marcus shook his head, his eyes calm but firm. "No need. The fight's already been won. Let them deal with their consequences in their own way." He turned away from the officers and began walking back toward the park bench, as if nothing had happened. He picked up his baseball cap from the ground, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. His posture was relaxed, as if he hadn't just single-handedly dismantled a gang of bikers. As he sat down once more on the old bench, the sounds of the park began to return to normal. Children laughed again in the distance. Joggers resumed their steady pace, and the ducks resumed their quiet swim in the pond. The breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. The peace that had been momentarily disrupted now seemed even more precious. But for Marcus, this brief return to normalcy was just a fleeting moment. He had done his part. He had stepped in when others wouldn't, when no one else could. He had acted. Now, it was time to move on, to leave Willow Creek Park behind, and let the ripples of his actions settle into the past. As the gang was loaded into the back of the police vehicles, Razor's eyes burned with rage. His body ached with the reminder of how badly he had been beaten. The loss of his gang's pride stung even more than the physical pain. "This ain't over," Razor muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. "We'll be back. You'll regret this, old man. You'll see." But deep down, Razor knew the truth. Marcus Kane had handed them their most humiliating defeat. The way he had moved like a shadow, swift and precise, was something none of them had ever encountered. He hadn't just disarmed them physically, he had shattered their belief that they were invincible. The older bikers, who had been silent throughout the encounter, exchanged nervous glances. They had seen their fair share of fights, but none of them had ever faced someone like Marcus Kane. The fear that had gripped them in those final moments of the fight still hadn't loosened its hold. Razor might be their leader, but it was clear that even he was shaken. The officers drove off, leaving the gang to stew in their thoughts. Razor knew the weight of their defeat would follow them. There would be no way to regain the lost respect, not after a humiliating encounter like that. News of the incident quickly spread through Willow Creek and the surrounding areas. Whispers of the old man who had taken down a gang of bikers spread like wildfire. People spoke in hushed tones, sharing their disbelief that someone so ordinary-looking could hold such power. Marcus had become a legend, not because he had sought recognition, but because his actions spoke for themselves. The local coffee shop buzzed with conversations about the event, and people exchanged stories about what they had seen. Some added embellishments, claiming they had seen Marcus disarm the entire gang with a single move, while others downplayed his involvement, suggesting that the police had arrived just in time to prevent a real disaster. But no matter the version, one thing was clear: the legend of Marcus Kane had been born. At the local diner, a waitress overheard a conversation between two men at the counter. "Did you hear about the bikers? They got taken down by some old guy in the park," one of the men said. "No kidding," the other replied, wide-eyed. "What's his deal? Some retired cop or something?" The first man shook his head. "Nah. They say he's some kind of retired military guy. Name's Marcus Kane. The way people talk about him, sounds like he's seen some serious action in his day. Must have been one hell of a fight. You have no idea." As the day drew to a close, Marcus sat quietly on the bench once more, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He could hear the sounds of the park around him, the chatter of people, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog, but all of it felt distant, almost muffled. He had returned to the place where it all began, but his mind was elsewhere, far beyond the park. His life had taken him to many places, some dark and dangerous, others filled with triumph and sorrow. He had seen the worst of humanity, and at times, he had been forced to confront it head-on. But in the end, it was always the quiet moments, the moments of peace, that made everything worth it. Kane didn't need to be recognized. He didn't need to be hailed as a hero. In the end, it wasn't about the fight, it was about the lives that were spared, the ones that had been saved from suffering because of the choices he made. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Marcus stood up from the bench, ready to move on. The quiet park was behind him now, but the memories of what he had done would remain, not as a burden, but as a reminder that sometimes, the smallest actions had the greatest impact. And with that, Marcus Kane walked away from Willow Creek Park, disappearing into the night. As the sun slowly set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park, the tranquil atmosphere seemed to return to its natural state. The birds continued to chirp, children's laughter still floated in the air, and the soft rustling of leaves danced with the breeze. The world around Willow Creek Park was at peace once again. But within the park, there was something different now, a shift in the energy, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. The story of what had happened earlier that afternoon would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The image of the quiet, unassuming man, who had single-handedly stopped a gang of dangerous bikers with calm precision, would stay with them for days, perhaps longer. Marcus Kane sat on the same weathered bench, his eyes focused on the ducks gliding across the pond. He didn't rush to get up. He didn't seek attention. There was a stillness about him that seemed to fit the peaceful landscape around him. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he observed the world, as though he understood more than most. It was as if he had lived through enough to know that the real strength didn't need to be shouted for attention. It didn't need to announce itself. Sometimes, strength doesn't roar. It doesn't break down doors with loud force or demand a crowd to witness its power. Sometimes, strength sits quietly, almost unnoticed, waiting for the right moment. It bides its time, patient and composed, knowing that the right opportunity will come. And when it does, that quiet strength reveals itself not with noise, but with decisive action that leaves no room for doubt. The story of Marcus Kane was one of many untold stories, hidden behind the wrinkles on his face and the calm that surrounded him. He didn't need to explain his past. He didn't need others to know about the battles he had fought or the losses he had endured. Some people, like Marcus, carried their history in silence, letting their actions speak louder than any words could. As the last of the bikers were driven away, handcuffed and defeated, a few people lingered around the park, their eyes lingering on the bench where Marcus sat. Some glanced over at him with curiosity, while others exchanged quiet whispers. They had seen what happened. They had witnessed a true display of power and discipline. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know that the man sitting on the bench had once been a general, a leader of men who had faced down battles that would have crushed lesser souls. They didn't know that the quiet man before them had commanded respect without ever needing to ask for it. In their eyes, he was just an old man, sitting in the park. But in their hearts, they felt the weight of the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones who don't need to boast about it. Sometimes, the greatest strength is the kind that simply remains calm and steady, ready to rise when it is needed. Marcus looked out across the pond again, watching the ripples of water spread out in ever-widening circles. He thought about how life had a way of bringing you to moments like this, moments where the quietest of actions could change everything. He could have walked away. He could have ignored the trouble, left the gang to terrorize the park and its visitors, but he didn't. He had chosen to step in. He had chosen to make a difference. It wasn't about the fight. It was about what came after the fight. It was about setting a boundary and ensuring that no one was above the rules of respect. The bikers had learned that the hard way. And while they might nurse their bruises for a while, the lesson they learned would stay with them. They would remember the man who had stood his ground, the man who had stopped their chaos with nothing more than calm resolve and the strength of his character. As Marcus sat there, alone on the bench, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or satisfaction. It was something quieter, more subtle. It was the kind of smile that comes from knowing that you've done the right thing, that you've acted when others wouldn't, and that in doing so, you've changed the course of things for the better. For him, that was enough. That was all he needed. Retirement, Marcus muttered softly to himself, still watching the ducks. It wasn't supposed to be boring. He had spent so many years in the military, following orders, leading troops, making decisions that affected entire lives. Now, as a retired man, he could have easily chosen a life of complete peace, staying away from conflict, settling into a life of quiet and simplicity. But that wouldn't have been him. He had never been the type to sit idly by, watching as the world spun around him. He had always been the type to act, to make a difference, to stand up when others couldn't or wouldn't. Perhaps, in a way, Marcus had found peace not by avoiding the storm but by walking through it, knowing that he was strong enough to face whatever came his way. And he had walked through it again today, in Willow Creek Park, in the most unexpected of places. The sounds of the park, the distant laughter, the footsteps of joggers, the soft whispers of the wind continued to fill the air. Marcus took one last look around, knowing that the quiet, peaceful rhythm of the world would continue, just as it always had. The ripples in the pond would fade, and the park would return to its normal flow. And he, too, would move on. As he stood up from the bench and turned to walk away, he felt something inside him stir, a quiet sense of contentment, of purpose fulfilled. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most important actions were the ones no one saw coming. The ones that happened without fanfare, without applause, without a single word spoken. Marcus Kane had found his peace, not in the silence of the park but in the knowledge that he had lived by his own code, and when the moment called for it, he had answered. There would always be another challenge, another fight, another opportunity to make a difference. But for now, he was content. He had done his part. And the world would continue to turn. The park grew quieter as the last of the evening light faded into twilight. Marcus walked away, the man who had once led soldiers, the man who had fought in wars, now just another figure blending into the crowd. But those who had witnessed his actions, those who had seen the quiet strength he possessed, would never forget him. They would remember the man who had risen to the moment, the man who had chosen to fight for what was right, even when no one asked him to. And as he disappeared into the night, the park seemed to breathe a little easier. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room was the one who had the most power. And those who mistook silence for weakness, they would be the ones who learned their lesson the hard way.